Now you should start showing the link first.
Mm-hmm. Anyways, yeah,
Okay.
we're live now.
Oh, hey. Yeah, we didn't show the link for the stream, so it might take a while for you all to show up. We usually do that in advance, but honestly, we usually stream twice a week, and we haven't been doing that as much. And I apologize for that. We're still scheduling the third part of the debate, and also there have been, I think, on a lot of people's ends here, some personal issues that we've been dealing with. So I just haven't been online generally much lately, but
I should be dead.
pretty much in the same boat.
No, I mean
Anyway,
I literally should not be alive right now. The fact that I'm even like uninjured at this particular moment is nothing short of miraculous. But
I
anyways,
don't disagree, but let's not turn both of our car accidents into a dick measuring contest.
that's fair.
uh, but anyway, yeah. So, do you want to talk about the video we're responding to today? Because honestly, I don't have much to say about it, and I wasn't able to watch much of it before the stream started. But it is very much the kind of video that I'm interested in.
Hmm. Yeah, so I'm pretty sure you can read the intro at the top. Ben Shapiro and Rep Ro Kahana, I think that's how you pronounce it. I don't know.
Rokana,
Uh,
that's Rokana.
all right. Anyway, so they're going to do a disagreement about the $15 minimum wage. For those of you who aren't aware, about a week ago, there was a controversy about the $1.9 trillion stimmy package that was being pushed through Congress, and whether or not that was going to include a mandatory $15 an hour minimum wage increase. Now, Ben Shapiro, as I'm sure you're aware, has his own radio show. And so what he did was he brought on Ro Kahana, who was a big proponent of the $15 minimum wage, to have a discussion in regards to whether or not that it was a good thing, an ethical thing, a moral thing, and something that the United States federal government ought to be interested in. Now, I'm going to withhold a lot of my comments in regards to the $15 an hour minimum wage until we start actually getting into the video. But yeah, this is the basis of this is largely going to be the topic of the stream. And from what I remember, at its current stage, the $1.9 trillion stimmy package in its current form has that $15 an hour uh, minimum wage hike removed. And that's being done specifically so it can get through Congress. Right now, it's passed through the House of Representatives. I think it still needs to get through the Senate. And
Okay.
I can tell you with reasonable certainty that it's going to probably be signed by Joe Biden, but there's also a decent chance that he'll veto it absent-mindedly because he probably thinks that he's voting he's voting to make sure that Ronald Reagan does not become president of the United States.
Fairly recently, this is related. It's not going to sound related at first, but just the people at the Anarcho house were we were watching the third Scary Movie, and there's a scene in that
Oh, we
movie
got a
where
makes
donation.
Snickers using
all
fried
right,
chicken. What's the difference between
I
McDonald's
can
and
tell it's a
Knicker?
good one, but I can't
McDonald's
hear it.
feeds its kids. Filthy sends Knickers to the Shadow Realm. ESO makes Knickers demand their mod roll back in the Backalley Discord server.
Apparently, you make tryhards demand their mod roll back in the back alley server, and I banish them to
Demod them.
and
Demod them.
I banish them to the shadow realm.
Remove their roles. Try hard. Attack them directly with Blue Eyes White Dragon. Try hard.
And also you trick tryhards with fried chicken. What's
Oh
the
my
difference?
god.
What's the difference between McDonald's and the tryhard? McDonald's feeds its kids.
Oh my god.
Yeah, so anyways, thank you for the $2,
Yeah.
Azure. And by the way, congratulations on passing your teaching certification thingy.
Yep. I really appreciate the donation and congrats. But just what I was saying a moment ago, there's a scene in the third Scary Movie where I don't know if you've seen those. They're really dumb, like lowbrow movies, but if you're approaching them from the perspective of not thinking about them technically, they can be kind of amusing.
Yeah, I've seen
The
I've seen some of the scary movies.
the president in those movies is just Joe Biden. I was watching, yeah, there's a scene in that movie where he's at like a Mother Teresa benefit for the disabled, and he starts punching people because he convinced himself that they were alien replicants pretending to be human. And I was just thinking I could totally picture Joe Biden doing this.
I don't think he has the physical strength to actually do that.
No.
I think if Joe Biden did attempt to punch someone, his arm would shatter. Either that or it would kind of be like a no-sell, like what happens like in a shonen anime where a character attempts to punch someone who's way stronger than them and it just doesn't even cause them to flinch.
I mean, in that sense, I agree, but like after the stream, everybody should go look that clip up because, just with the context that this is supposed to be a representation of Joe Biden, it makes it a lot funnier. But yeah, so getting onto the video. Yeah, Heretic and I are not going to... We're obviously not critics of the notion that minimum wage causes disemployment. But at the same time, Ben Shapiro's response has a lot of economic problems, and I've expressed before that I'm more interested when it comes to putting forward rebuttals of competing claims about the nature of things, to actually steel manning the strongest possible version of their argument. And part of that is also putting forward the most concrete, the most epistemologically sound rebuttals, and any rebuttal that's starting from the premise of the monetarist study of econ being legitimate is going to run into some issues, but we'll talk about that more in a moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so anyways, don't know if there's really much more we can say to... Wait, what the heck is this?
But
no, sorry, just the Streamlabs giving me some kind of notification. Not really important. So yeah, we're fine. Anyways, so yeah, should we get started with the video?
yeah, sure.
All right, so here's Ben Shapiro dropkick Murphying Ro Kahana with facts and logic. Let's go.
Good to be back.
It's a pleasure
to
to
be
welcome
back
onto the
making
program
videos.
Representative Ro Khanna. He represents California's 17th congressional district, located in the heart of Silicon Valley. He is serving his third term. Representative Khanna is, of course, a Democrat, and for that, we're extremely grateful because it's fun to have on people from the other party and actually talk through the issues. Representative Khanna, thanks so much for joining the show.
And thank you for having me on. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, you bet. So let's talk about minimum wage, because you sort of made the news last week when you were criticized for some comments that you made about the minimum wage and small businesses. The implication seemed to be that if businesses weren't paying a higher minimum wage, then maybe they didn't deserve to be in business. So what did you mean by those comments?
Well, let me clarify it. I am a strong supporter of small business. I understand the need for small business. I do believe in a $15 minimum wage.
That's such a... I'm sorry, I gotta... Okay, it's paused. That is such a bullshit... That's such a bullshit statement. I support these economic actors. There's no teeth behind that statement, especially coming from a politician, because the fundamental premise which a political framework for your argument operates around is fundamentally the assumption that there aren't concrete truths about about social organization or about the nature of how people act, or just like what's legitimate between different actors. There's just the state being a monopoly and it should use its might a certain way. So there is not a single political position that could not say the exact same thing. And considering that those specific market actors are very important tax cattle, there's never going to be a politician that comes along and says, "Oh yeah, the middle class, the people running local shops who go through all those licensing hoops we set up, fuck those guys." Never gonna happen.
Well, those people do exist. Typically, they call themselves congressmen. But what I actually wanted to stop on this just simply because I want to take a moment to appreciate the sheer audacity and hubris that Kana is demonstrating here by trying to say, like, oh, yeah, I support small businesses, as though he is in some position where he can dictate the terms by which people can organize economically, as though he was in a position that he somehow feels the need to justify to
Yeah.
Shapiro, but also to Shapiro's audience, that no, I am not trying to deliberately destroy, or sorry, not deliberately destroy, but just like deliberately use government force to aggress against people who organize and exchange in certain ways. This
Yeah,
is it's very clear also that he's trying to set up the butt. It's like, I support free speech, I support people's rights to not be aggressed upon, but
yeah.
it's
What were you gonna say?
nothing, not really.
Okay.
Gonna finish.
Well, all right. Well, I was just going to add, what counts as support. That's kind of the thing that is not really a relevant question for a political perspective. And given that your standard for what counts as support, that's going to inform your entire argument. That's kind of an important thing that the political framework just misses entirely and doesn't address. And there's a reason for that. It's because every single political approach is only able to use one entailment. Beat the fucking crap out of them if they don't do what we say. And not only is that not very attractive, but that's also it kind of reveals the major problem with political institutions, and that's that they only have one means that they can employ: either steal resources from people in order to, deprive them of their ability to act, or in order to privilege other politically connected actors in society. So it's kind of a meaningless statement for someone to say, "I support this," in contrast with a supposedly competing position, because they're both fundamentally proposing the exact same thing, and that is taboo in state circles, in statist circles, and in political circles. Because if everybody is representing the same class interest and everybody's employing the same means, how are we going to arrive at these supposedly more ideal outcomes?
What I'm seeing here also, and I was thinking about it as you were talking, and the way he's set up what he's going to say very strongly comes off like he's deliberately trying to deceive people. Now, it makes sense because you don't become a congressperson, especially in frickin' Silicon Valley, unless you're a goddamn liar. Unless you're completely comfortable with going up to people face to face, smiling at them, and then genuinely speaking something that you know to be completely untrue. And so
Yeah.
this is what I think he's doing when he's trying to set up like, oh well, I support small businesses. Who, and as we identified earlier, like, who feels the need to have to begin anything they say saying that they're in support of it unless they're going to denigrate it later. It's very clear that the guy has no idea what he's actually saying. Probably doesn't even have a concept of what a business or even any kind of commercial enterprise could possibly be. He's just trying to say things that he believes that Ben Shapiro and his audience would want to hear to try to disarm them, get them to lower their mental defenses, to make them feel a bit more comfortable that this lying piece of crap is trying to propose using government violence against people who form contracts with others that he doesn't happen to like.
He's putting forward a pretext to just justify the position that as a class actor, his higher ups are telling him he has to justify.
Mm-hmm. So, anyways, he's going to go ahead and try to explain the minimum wage in the while having set up the context that, oh, I support small businesses. But anyways, let's continue.
My belief is that the Amazons, Targets, Walmarts can easily pay that, but I understand that small businesses may have a difficult time in doing that. That's why it needs to be gradual, and that's why we need to have tax credits and other assistance to small business so that they can do that.
So let's talk about the actual policy, the actual $15.
Hold on a second. I just want to see if I saw that right.
So that they can do that.
So let's talk about.
What the hell is that?
What?
At the end of his statement, he winks.
Gradual, and that's why we need to have tax credits and other assistance to small business so that they can do that.
So let's talk about.
You see that?
I did.
What was that?
What is that? What does that fucking mean?
I watched this video before. I did not see that at first, but
yeah, that just caught. I didn't notice that earlier either. What do you know that we don't? Well, actually, you don't. I'm pretty sure that just aside from the sort of classified info that the state has, don't, because what you're proposing is kind of obvious. You used the example of Amazon and Walmart both being market actors, which could easily, which wouldn't really be affected much by the minimum wage going up. Well, that's obviously to disadvantage other actors in various labor markets in local economies, in order to make it more difficult to compete with them. And of course, the tax crediting scheme, that's just another layer of leverage that the state is putting over market actors who are quote unquote small businesses to make it less likely they'll step out of line. Because at that point, literally the reason that they're existing is because of governments giving them quote unquote tax credits.
The tax credit thing is actually very important, and I would strongly encourage our audience to pay attention whenever tax credits or any other kind of subsidies are mentioned as a kind of band-aid to any financial harm that state agents recognize would be the result of their particular use of government coercion at that particular time. Because the overwhelming majority of the issues that we identify with the state is the extent to which it exercises leverage over individuals, over property, over people using their own resources. And this is just a perfect example where suddenly businesses rely on the state simply to have employees at all and not have a situation where you have one person fulfilling 5 jobs because that's all that particular employer can afford to do in order to maintain a profit margin.
It is very interesting, though, that until fairly recently, the statists on the, I guess you could call them liberal side of politics, in the American context, of course. But until fairly recently, they were just straight up denying that there was a disemployment effect being caused by minimum wage laws. Well, now they're sort of implicitly conceding that point. but now are proposing a subsidy scheme. So we're conceding that this is the case, even though as it's framed in mainstream political discourse, there are still some problems with that, and we'll get into it in a moment. But by which I mean problems with the sort of Laffer curve critique of minimum wage. But yeah, it's interesting how they changed the debate without conceding, but are also somehow finding themselves in the position where the state has leverage over local economies.
I distinctly remember about 6 or 7 years ago, back when I was conservator, that there were people who were unironically arguing that minimum wage actually lowered unemployment. They would make appeals to Keynesian shenanigans, where they believe that
multiplier argument.
Multiplier argument, but more specifically, it was just like, well, higher wages means that people will have more spending money, and therefore they'll spend that money at businesses, and then those businesses will have more money, and it's actually going to make things more. Oh, we got another thing. We got another donation. Derek Johnson says, I might be in the shadow realm, but a Nibba still want to donate. I love your guys' stuff.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it.
Oh, don't worry. We'll let you out of the shadow realm in a couple months.
Right. But what were you saying, Heretic?
So basically, not even a decade ago, they were not only refusing to accept the argument that minimum wage lowered employment, but they would actually try to say that it's actually good for employment because of the multiplier effect in spending. They seem to not be under any impression whatsoever that people who would suddenly get a wage increase would be interested in saving. Like, that would not be a thing that they would consider.
It's
Apparently,
Keynesianism. Yeah, that's just Keynesianism 101. Spending, no matter the reason for the spending, is something that is beneficial for the political economy, which, if we're speaking specifically in context, in the context of the state's interests, is somewhat accurate, not as an economic principle, but just as the interest, as an explanation of the interest that the state has in how it tries to engineer economic incentives. But I've noticed that even as far as state academia goes, Keynesianism has been falling out of favor lately in favor of MMT because of sort of the fundamental problems with Keynesianism coming to a head. The not being able to get around the broken window fallacy, problems that more people are expressing with general equilibrium models altogether, much less GDP. Yeah, this is the MMT version of the same argument, essentially. Well, yes, it causes disemployment, but we could just, money printer go burr, so not a problem.
yeah, clearly. Although it's absolutely hilarious, because another thing I remember from 6 or 7 years ago in the minimum wage argument was trying to say, like, oh, but it's actually a good thing for the government as well, because if people are earning more wages and businesses are earning more money, then that means it's going to make more tax revenue. So this is actually going to reduce government deficits and stuff like that. Whereas here, they completely dropped that premise completely. They're saying, like, yeah, let's just throw money at the problem. It's going to fix it. It's actually
much harder.
Sorry.
What were you going to say? I was just going to say it's a much harder sell, which is why more and more people are becoming disillusioned practically all the time with the state.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I wonder I wonder how many people have to check into the hospital every now and then just because of the whiplash of how quickly their arguments change.
Uh, yeah, that's the insane thing that I've been talking about lately, and I've been playing around with this general premise, uh, because it would make a good subject for an essay. But I was completely in the dark about the spending bill that you were talking about, and that's because at this point I don't pay attention to political discourse at all. And the reason for it is that it's so insane that you can't follow it. Um, and a couple of people have, noticed the same thing and have tried to explain exactly what's happening. But what's happened is, it wasn't until fairly recently I was able to put my finger on it, and that is that reality itself has become politicized from the perspective of mainstream politics in most parts of the world at the moment. But
Oh,
what arguments you're going to promote, um, they are determined entirely by what political affiliation you attempt to align yourself with. What you're considering to be true is determined entirely by essentially what state media or the government tells you is the position affiliated with that political leaning. Which is the reason why within the last year, especially. Oh my God. Okay, hold on.
I'm sorry. I found that. I just found it hilarious. I completely derailed the conversation. I'm sorry.
I remember what I was gonna say, but do you want to show it on the stream?
It'll take me a couple minutes, so go ahead and continue.
Okay, well, that's the reason why if you listen to state media, at this point, the scripts contradict themselves mid-sentence, and they don't acknowledge that they've even contradicted themselves. That's just passed as though it's a perfectly rational thing to argue. There was a screenshot from Irish state media, that I saw recently. And I think that it perfectly summarizes the nature of media right now. One person died yesterday. That's four more than the day before. Have you seen that?
One person died today. That's four more than the day before.
Yeah, that's four more than yesterday.
I haven't actually, but I'm not terribly surprised. Namely, because I think we've all seen how coronavirus deaths have just been so heavily politicized.
It's exactly the way that we were talking about this before the stream started, but it's media and political narratives being promoted by the state are mimicking the exact same manipulation tactics that are that's used by government education to try to strip away the ability to critically think about narratives being put forward.
I mean, it's also not terribly surprising because we've talked about this before on previous streams about how in the Sovereign Individual they pointed out how when in the tail end of the medieval period, the church did everything it could to religioushize, if that's a word, just about everything in reality. How everything was supposed to have some religious significance in order to maintain the church's relevance in people's lives. This was important because with the Protestant Reformation coming about, Black Death and various other things that caused the church's power to significantly diminish and their credibility to go down, they needed this amount of propaganda to make people psychologically dependent on the church to maintain kind of an anchor in reality. This
It's
is something.
because under the sort of feudal order of medieval Europe, religion was being used as the thing that tied people's interests to the policies being implemented by the state, that got people invested in what the state was doing and caused them to affiliate what their interests were with the state. Nowadays, that role has been replaced by parties. But yeah, that's the reason why a lot of early anarchist posters had carried the phrase "No gods, no masters." I think that the modern libertarian movement needs to bring back that spark directed towards the party system. As a direct, because that's exactly how people are getting sucked into statism.
It is very much the new religion, and they're doing everything they can to make it ubiquitous in people's lives, to the point where life and death itself is quite literally politicized. It is a partisan issue. Just bring up, for example, that if the CDC counted coronavirus deaths now the same way they counted swine flu deaths in 2008, that that we would have roughly 10,000 people having died from the COVID-19. But
20
of course,
million people. 20 million people didn't die under the Soviet Union when Stalin was the general commissariat. It was only 3 million. Take that, Nazis. State only killed this many millions of people, not that many.
and that's exactly the trick. You create a sense of a kind of hyper reality where everything is constantly changing and everything is so chaotic. You have a crazy world and you have people's lives through artificial scarcity becoming particularly chaotic, where people aren't even entirely sure how they're going to feed their families tomorrow. And then you set the government up as the anchor in people's lives, and that's what they're trying to set. That's what they're trying to get people into, inculcating them into a new form of a new religiosity. I would call it scientism, but scientism is a bit more specific in regards to just blind faith in whatever it is that someone who looks credible says on TV.
Yeah. Scientism is when you, for ideological purposes, attempt to apply a method of analysis to a study that's not really appropriate for. A good example of this would be people using the mouse utopia, not the mouse utopia experiment, but the fuck, I'm blanking on the term, but the one that people who argue positively for a state ban on gambling use, the one by B.F. Skinner,
the Skinner box experiment.
Yeah, using the Skinner box experiment to try to map out human psychology would be an example of scientism.
Mm-hmm. That is certainly one way to look at it. However, I don't quite recall the Skinner box experiment. I only know that it gets referenced every now and then in reference to loot boxes and loot box mechanics in video games.
But what were you saying?
I actually don't quite remember.
Okay. Well, I'm trying to backtrack, but yeah, we should continue with the video anyway because we've been going off topic for like 10 minutes.
Yeah. So, anyways, before I start, I did backtrack the video like 2 or 3 seconds. Keep an eye out for let's see, it's going to be this eye right here. He's going to wink at the camera as soon as he's finished talking, and I have no idea what the hell that means, and actually it's got me pretty spooked.
It's too small business so that they can do that.
So let's talk about the actual policy, the actual $15 minimum wage. So I obviously am an opponent of the $15 minimum wage. When it comes to the minimum wage, there are a bevy of studies, including Congressional Budget Office studies, suggesting that it depresses employment, that for people who actually receive the minimum wage, of course, they get paid more. But for a lot of other people, it pushes them out of the job market because it is not like businesses actually just have a giant Scrooge McDuck money bank out back, and they're just holding a bunch of cash out there in order to somehow disadvantage their employees, that there is a labor market in which there are a lot of people willing to work for a particular wage, and that they're paying the labor, essentially what the labor is willing to accept in order to work at these particular jobs. When you're talking about competitive job markets, especially at the lower end of the wage spectrum, isn't it true that there is a supply and demand issue that actually develops the wage? Or why do you think that it's artificially low, in other words?
Yeah, so this is the main issue that monetarists are making. Well, this gets into sort of a whole host of issues, but it stems from their idea that there exists a sort of hegemonic job market, that there's just a job market that's prescribed onto every economy in a nation, and that there's just a sort of general competitive wage that all of them operate around, regardless of the economy that they're in or what market they're attempting to, as laborers, compete in, etc. There are a lot of problems here, and but the effect, obviously, that Ben Shapiro is describing, that monetarists in general are describing, generally speaking, is not wrong. However, the emphasis is being placed, even in concept, the way it's being proposed, the emphasis is being misplaced. What's happening here is not, for certain markets, it causes obvious disemployment, but it privileges other market actors at their expense. And that's the main concern here, both from the economic perspective and from the philosophical perspective, is that the state is creating a sort of class of privileged market actors at the expense of other people who are simply trying to sell their labor.
I remember a few years ago reading about how in several labor union contracts, there's actually a thing where even if they don't make minimum wage themselves, their wages and their earnings actually increase with the minimum wage. So and given how politically or how heavily connected labor unions are to U.S. politicians. I mean, you're talking about like one of the largest donors or one of the largest donors of any organization in the country right now is labor unions. They are very heavily politically connected, so it makes sense that they would lobby for a minimum wage increase if that would result in them receiving greater amounts of money as well.
Well, it depends specifically on the labor union you're talking about. If you're talking about the OSHA shills, then yeah, they're basically just cartels for local labor markets. But if you're talking about like Burger Town or the IWW, they aren't politically connected, although they're technically decentralized movements.
Well, not all of them, of course. I'm usually referring to like the large bureaucratic labor unions like SEIU, AFL-CIO, that ilk.
Yeah. But just what I was going to say is this is why I think that it's kind of disheartening to see some people in Austrian circles making the monetarist argument against wage, because there actually is kind of an important distinction there. Not just from the economic, not just from the the libertarian perspective, but also because the monetarist position, while it pays lip service to many concepts that Austrians also agree are legitimate economic phenomenon because of the fact that monetarists are operating around the assumption that there is sort of a political economy that ought to be engineered a certain way through various different institutions to create an administered pricing scheme. The problem that gets introduced is that monetarists are, if they were to talk about something like Say's law, well, they don't actually understand Say's law, or at the very least, what they're proposing is not capable of actually reaching that conclusion because they're not making a neutral observation about how supply affects demand. They're just saying that supply should be this way contrasted with demand, and here are incentives the government could manufacture in order to accomplish this goal, supposedly.
Mm-hmm. Don't really have
So,
anything. Sorry.
and I was just going to add that there are a lot of people who share Friedman stuff, Milton Friedman's material around, or the material of Thomas Sowell, as though they justify state skeptic positions, but they really don't. As we've argued previously, and as Konkin put it so lovingly in the New Libertarian Manifesto, they are efficiency experts for the government.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I as a conservative, I unironically remember putting forward arguments like the Laffer curve, as though that were some kind of state skeptical position to hold.
Shane argued that position in previous videos, and I think I mentioned it once back when I was still making vulgar libertarian content.
Yeah, but I mean, the important part is that we got better, and we recognize it to be as erroneous as it is, and it is very useful when other libertarians do make those mistakes to point it out, because I would think that at some level they would appreciate that, not accidentally making arguments that are unintentionally promotional of state power. I don't think they want to do that.
Keep in mind that the minimum wage being lower or non-existent wouldn't disempower the state if we're speaking specifically in the context of actors that operate around the state's political economy. It would just empower them at the expense of people who don't operate in the white market political economy. By making it so there's less risk associated with the white market. And so it's more difficult to compete with white market actors in the current infrastructure of society. So that's not a position that should be defended from the libertarian perspective, because white market actors being empowered does not help us. It just means that the government has more leverage over our economic activity, over the resources that we trade, along with our incentives that we associate with those resources. And it means that it also means that of course, that more tax revenue is shaved off of those transactions, which are used to put bullets in the guns of their enforcers and bombs in the military's drones.
I mean, I thought that money was going towards putting bombs in the living rooms of brown people.
That too.
Well, at the very least, they get pretty rapid delivery. Anyways, should we continue?
Yeah, sure.
Let me suggest the two places we disagree.
Actually, hold on a second. Just remember there's another point I wanted to make, and that is that I have a feeling that Kana is going to go into this, but we're going to be seeing one of the biggest problems I have with how things are discussed nowadays, and this leads into the scientism we were talking about not long ago, and that is that people are just going to be throwing trying to throw competing studies at each other.
Yeah, well, that's especially that's sorry, blanking on the way of putting it, but that's sort of a big thing that you see with state academia and economics. That's because that's a point that the state can't afford to concede. Because if they specifically the notion that economies need to operate around around financial or like political institutions, because if they concede that point, well, then it kind of becomes obvious that the state is nothing more than a parasitic ruling class that can't justify its existence. But yeah, that's a point that they're not going to give ground on. But at the same, honestly, I would be more skeptical of monetarists at this point. While modern monetary theory is being pushed very heavily by state media and state academia, monetarists are posing themselves, and monetarist econ is posing itself, even though, as we've just noted earlier, it fundamentally affirms the same political positions on the market uh, as any other prescriptive anti-libertarian take on markets would. It's being positioned as though it's the antithesis to Keynesianism or modern monetary theory, even though it shares far more in common with them than it does the Austrian school.
Yeah, we were talking about this before the stream started, actually, where you were writing a comment in the back alley responding to globalism and how the anti-globalist narrative is fundamentally, or how how globalism itself is put forward as a controlled opposition narrative.
Right. It's not it's not an inherent interest to central banking, uh, along with incentives manufactured in one state's own local economy, that causes governments to network together and create groups like the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, the Trilateral Commission, etc., which have a massive amount of influence, I should say, over supply chains, and also can administer certain rates that'll influence incentives in local economies, has nothing to do with an inherent interest to the state. It's just people thinking that there needs to be a one world government. It's an ideological preference. It's not something the state has an inherent interest to do. It's not something states have been doing for thousands of years.
And even then, like, I think even that they would be well aware of the fact that governments scale absolutely horrendously. They can't even control a region as large as a continent, let alone every continent or every inhabited continent on Earth. That would just be a logistical and bureaucratic nightmare. The idea that globalism is an actual legitimate threat that people need to spend all of their time and effort combating is it's ludicrous. There's really no other way of putting it. But yeah, the point I was just making before is that everything that's going on nowadays is not merely just that they've created the new religion of statism in order to dazzle everybody's attention and make politics as ubiquitous in people's lives as possible, to make people act in ways to preserve the state because they can't see themselves existing without politics. But you also have a situation where you have two competing sets of controlled narratives. In the late medieval period, you had a single narrative, namely the narrative of the church, which anchored everybody together. Whereas today, what you have is two competing sets of narratives, two parties, and the opposition and confrontation between the two is used to get people to maintain the size and power of the state. The only real difference between like the medieval period and the modern period in regards to people being dazzled by by this religious theater is the presence or absence, respectively, of the Hegelian dialectic model.
Right. No, I wouldn't. I 100% support that.
Oh,
All
and
right.
Faithless Berserker in the comments asking, speaking of globalism, why did you never end up making that video about Alex Jones?
I don't necessarily. I don't necessarily think that that's canceled. I still have an intent to write a script about not Alex Jones specifically, but controlled opposition and specifically how to combat controlled opposition and how to identify it, and maybe use Alex Jones as an example.
I would
But
think you should. Sorry.
what were you gonna say?
I was going to suggest using Alex Jones as a framing device. You make the video about Alex Jones because if you have like Alex Jones in the thumbnail, you have him on a hashtag, and you have like him in the title, that's going to generate clicks. And then you use him as a framing device for why he is the perfect example of controlled opposition.
So I still have an intention on making a video, I guess, about Alex Jones or about controlled opposition. I just haven't gotten around to it. And in case you haven't seen, it's been about 4 months since I've uploaded a video. So I haven't, there are a lot of things I want to write about that I just haven't gotten around to because of various different factors. But would you like to continue, or
Yeah.
did you have anything to say?
Nope, I'm good. Let's continue. All right, let's see if he winks again. I actually don't know if he's going to be finishing his sentence or not, but I'm curious if he's doing any more of these like little tells that he's giving to someone who's listening specifically.
Is that just a mannerism he has, or is that something that he deliberately telegraphed to some specific person that was watching?
Yeah, I'm curious. But anyways, let's continue.
Your view, as I understand it, is this is a contract between two free individuals. Why is the government, the state, getting involved in trying to set the price? My view is that in certain cases, especially where you have monopsonies, where you have a high concentration in labor markets, there are only a few buyers. It's not a truly competitive market. It's actually
Sorry?
Yeah, you mean the he's referring to monopsonies, which just means a condition that's effectively a monopoly, but there's multiple actors. Motherfucker, the government creates those.
Mm-hmm.
They literally could not exist without barriers to entry. That's the defining characteristic of a monopoly. There are barriers to entry being set up, which make it so only certain market actors can actually produce things.
I had actually forgotten what the term monopsony meant, so I had to look it up before the video started. It's basically a monopoly, except instead of a single seller, there's a single buyer. But the economic structure and the incentives are more or less the same. And yeah, Esso is absolutely correct that everything that he's talking about in terms of there being a single buyer or very few buyers in what Rokana is going to refer to as the labor markets, as though we're a single hegemonic entity, is more or less correct in the sense that the number of buyers and actors that could exist in the labor market is artificially suppressed. There is an artificial scarcity in that, specifically because of the amount of coercion and the amount of subsidies given to a very small number of companies that in various regulatory innovations that do their best to make sure that it is extremely difficult to be a competing actor in any one of these industries, thus making sure that you have, I guess you could call it an oligopoly.
Yeah, and there are two major reasons why monopolies are exclusively products of government. And keep in mind that until the early 20th century, it was fairly uncontroversial. It was actually a narrative promoted by the government itself that monopolies were created by the government. The way in which that was justified during the 19th century, though, or the way that that was sort of sold as a political position, is that, well, those are market actors sponsored by the government, and you vote for the government, don't you? So obviously, those market actors have your interest in mind because they're being sponsored by the state. Yeah, so there are two major reasons why that can't happen. First of all, diseconomy of scale, and there are a couple of different ways in which a firm scaling upwards without any sort of other market actors in that specific trade within whatever economy we're talking about. There are several problems that creates, mainly with economic calculation, along with certain costs that become amplified because of that, such as transportation costs, which, by the way, that's the reason why governments have a monopoly on roads. It's so transportation costs that these big firms would otherwise have are externalized. Yeah, the other problem that this causes is, comes in the form of information being conveyed within the firm in question. When a firm scales upward and there becomes a sort of centralized management bureaucracy trying to oversee countless resources that are being used to produce things that the firm needs to sustain itself. Well, a problem that creates is the more it scales upward, the more difficult it is for information to be conveyed within the various levels of management bureaucracy. And on top of that, conflicts of interest begin to emerge, which make it so certain actors within the firm have an incentive not to convey that information to certain other levels of management, because it would come with a cost associated to their own position. Like someone stocking shelves at Walmart, for example, breaking something off the shelf. They have an incentive not to report that, even though that's important for the firm's ability to calculate profits and losses. But I digress. My point is that the notion that you could have a monopoly or an oligopoly or any sort of situation like that in an economy free of intervention is absurd. And I'm kind of surprised that fewer Austrians have pointed to this, or fewer libertarians have argued this. But government intervention itself inherently entails resources being dislocated, because government intervention is just the government systematically using violence in a certain way in order to engineer certain incentives by associating risk with a certain task, with a certain action that they're trying to disincentivize people from engaging in. That means that people who might otherwise organize their firm around certain models, or might be entrepreneurs in some markets or laborers in some markets, will have to invest their resources elsewhere, doing things that aren't as profitable to them, because there is less risk associated with doing those things. And as a result, things which could be produced, or resources we could have by people who actually would enjoy doing those things, that's being invested elsewhere, turning people into essentially just drones who have no incentive to actually work on what they're producing.
Mm-hmm. Don't really have much more to add to that, so let's go ahead and continue.
Market failure, and so you have a wage that is. I'm
going to back up a little bit, because he used a very important phrase there.
where you have a high concentration in labor markets, there are only a few buyers. It's not a truly competitive market. It's actually a market failure. And so you have a wage that is under the competitive market price. In fact,
Yeah, that's basically what I thought. You got the perfect example of Schrodinger's statism, which is, I believe, the term you used, where some negative outcome that is clearly the result of government intervention, as we identified previously, is claimed to be the result of there not being enough government.
Everything is going fine when people are satisfied, but the moment that people aren't satisfied, because it's ultimately not even whether or not things in society are going smoothly, it's just whether or not people are disillusioned with a certain aspect of the state's meddling. Yeah, as soon as people are disillusioned, suddenly, where's the government? It's nowhere to be seen.
Well, I mean, you have to realize that prior to the passage of this $1.9 trillion stimmy package, there is zero government intervention in labor whatsoever. Literally, the entirety of labor in the United States is completely untouched by the government, and that includes at every level, from what jobs you're allowed to have, all the way to the standards by which employers can hire you, what they can pay you, what benefits you can get, overtime, that sort of thing. It's
The cash
complete. It's
nexus.
the cash
The
nexus.
cash nexus definitely doesn't exist either. So
It definitely doesn't exist.
political institutions aren't influencing supply chains or interest rates and credit ratings, and aren't influencing which actors have essentially first dibs to these resources. There isn't any sort of systematic problem which is causing administrative pricing schemes to exist in the first place. Not at all. That just happens without a government. Central banks just happen without a government, don't you know?
Of course. And also it just happens spontaneously as well. You just have small numbers of actors that get huge amounts of government subsidies just magically, but without any government involvement whatsoever. I mean, if you disagree with everything I'm saying, then you're just a bigot, a crazy conspiracy theorist, and you probably want grandma to die.
I mean, yeah, this isn't even getting into the economic problems with what he's arguing. The idea again that there is just sort of a hegemonic labor market, so that there could be a competitive labor price that every firm just sort of implicitly knows about in every firm everywhere. Yeah, that's absurd, but it's not nearly as absurd as trying to act. Still, honestly, I don't want to bring up current year, but how many hundreds of years have these people been pulling the Schrodinger's statism, and people are still fucking going along with it as though there's nothing wrong with that?
I mean, I've been hearing it for as long as I've been politically active. So this has been. I'm absolutely certain that if you were to go back, you would be able to find examples of Schrodinger's statism in action. Probably going back even several centuries, but it's certainly been going on for as long as I can remember.
Imagine like sending a state socialist back in time to like the 1850s and seeing some socialist politician say, "Oh, we need more state monopolies. And every time these monopolies fail, it's because there was actually competition."
I think that would. Oh well, considering the way that they think is largely influenced by other people, they'd probably go, "Yeah." They would see no problems with that argument whatsoever. They might be a little confused for a moment, but then their conditioning through government schools to just go along with whatever the important looking person says will kick in, and they'll be completely fine with it. These are the kinds of people who would be allergic to thinking for themselves, so it's not terribly unusual. But anyways, I'm just going to reply to a comment by Spiffy Spifferson. What's the origin behind the name Filthy Heretic? The filthy part is, of course, a pejorative, and it kind of flows well with heretic. And the heretic part is just simply the observation that we don't really have the choice to be an apostate from the religion of statism as much as we'd like to be. We can certainly work towards that goal, but yeah, unfortunately, we're still forced to associate with the state. We're still forced to associate with the Church of the Omnipotent State.
And Esoteric Kennedy doesn't really have a name. It doesn't really have a cool story behind it. It's just a cool name that I thought of. But Eso sounds nice, so I go with it. Sounds more like a name and less like somebody who would be promoting David Icke content.
I mean, I could have used different names, but I kind of wanted to, not associate my previous online identities with this one. So yeah. Plus,
I get what you're saying. Ooh woo.
No, actually, it's completely benign. It's just that
sure, wink.
Anyways, continuing.
Milton Friedman in 1976 wrote about this possibility.
It's the social democrat who cites Milton Friedman first. I just find that funny.
Yeah, it's actually a market failure, and so you have a wage that is under the competitive market price. In fact, Milton Friedman in 1976 wrote about this possibility that monopolies could distort the market wage. Second, and I think this is just a good faith disagreement, you would argue people have genuine bargaining power, and you have this concept of negative freedom, that the state shouldn't interfere. My view is that more of positive freedom, that people actually need basic support to be able to bargain effectively. And I don't think that there's true equal bargaining power often.
So there are a couple of issues.
Yeah, so should we address that? Because here's an interesting take. I'm not sure that Heretic has, but I would also promote, and was also promoted by a lot of early modern libertarians, but positive and negative liberties. That's a false dichotomy, and it implies, actually, if following it back to its entailment, actually carries a pretty nasty snuck assumption, which is that there isn't a distinction between how one acts and the ethical nature of an action. But yeah, this is a false dichotomy. If you create a contract with somebody in order for them to, say, give you healthcare, you would be entitled to that thing. This is why Heretic and I argue within the framework of claim rights and liberty rights instead, because we're making it very clear that we're not making that ethical principles are not making prescriptive statements about how people how people act, or how people ought to act, or how people ought to think. That's a very common mistake that's made by a lot of ethical philosophies. Well, at least in as far as mainstream discourse is concerned. But I even within the Backalley, I see a lot of people operating within the positive and negative rights dichotomy. Well, it operates around the assumption that there are actions inherently associated with certain ethical views. When ethical philosophies make statements about every single action, just not in a prescriptive sense. It's making claims in the libertarian sense, at least, that here are things that can or can't be conceptually justified actions need to be conceptually justified. The burden of proof falls upon the person who is acting, because our actions are, we have conscious influence over our actions. Therefore, the burden of proof falls upon the active party always. So, so if we're going to talk about ethics from the libertarian perspective, then it's not really coherent to argue in a prescriptive sense, because not only does that negate entailments informing what our ethical principles are. So, what specific things being true lead to this specific ethical conclusion. It negates that possibility, and thus makes it impossible to make concrete claims in ethical philosophy. But another problem that it introduces is obviously the is-ought gap, which is not a problem in ethical philosophy, as the person who proposed it, David Hume, even argued in his essay, Treatise on Human Nature, in Section 3, the first part of Section 3. But I'm sorry, that's all that I really had to say.
Mm-hmm. Well, right now I'm just thinking about.
I had more
of,
to say, but I lost my train of thought, admittedly.
It's all right. Well, what I was thinking about is this kind of snuck assumption that Kana is trying to put forward, and that he's positioning himself as the savior of the workers and of the people in regards to their employers and employees, or in regards to the employer and employee relationship. He thinks that somehow that there is some imbalance in the employer-employee relationship, which to a certain extent you can certainly make that assumption. However, he thinks that he needs to be the one to go in and save people, to protect people from predatory employers.
That's
And
the
I
way
don't.
he's framing his argument. I legitimately don't think that any politicians actually believe that. Because literally what it means to be a politician is to conduct the way that the state acts in certain ways, and the state can only use violence. Violence only limits the resources that people have access to.
It's certainly useful for politicians to position themselves in certain ways, and you can see this in populists throughout history, as they try to position themselves as the savior of the people. And what ends up happening is that they try to insert a snuck assumption into the population that they cannot exist but for, or they cannot have their interests achieved but for the existence of this particular politician or group of politicians.
But there's what I was getting to a moment ago before I lost my train of thought was that there's a snuck assumption inherent in the positive negative rights dichotomy, and that's that there is a prescriptive statement you can make about what is right. And I went over that, but the implication of it and how it benefits the state specifically is that it assumes that because enforcement, or how one defends themselves, is divorced simultaneously from what is considered a right, it is also contingent on rights existing, that inherently leads people towards just assuming that punitive models of arbitration have to be at the center of society. Because if there wasn't a central arbiter, well then how obviously could rights exist?
Mm-hmm. Now, just to address something that Spiffy Spifferson is saying, he is forgetting something that's very important in regards to my name and why I chose heretic over apostate. and that is that heretic sounds cooler.
You have two names that sound really cool. If we're going to refer to you through shorthand lingo, filthy and heretic.
Yay. Well, people tend to address me using either of them. They either call me filthy or they call me heretic. And I also get people all the time like, would you rather be called filthy or heretic? And I'm just like, honestly, I don't really care. You can use either.
Since they're not really common names, it's kind of obvious who's being referred to.
Yeah. So anyways, I'm just going to go ahead and continue here.
Issues that I see in some of the stuff that you're saying here, just on the specific level. Obviously, the vast majority of employees at places like Amazon are actually not making the minimum wage. The fact is that the minimum wage is only being made by something like 2.3% of all wage earners in the United States. About 50% of those wage earners are under the age of 25. And when you artificially boost the minimum wage, what you actually end up doing is making it harder for people who actually need the minimum wage jobs to get those jobs, because you have artificially created a base in the labor market from which employers are going to draw. So in other words, a $15 wage is the kind of wage that you pay to somebody who graduated from college. It's not typically the kind of wage that you pay for somebody who graduated from high school. And you see this historically with the minimum wage. When the federal minimum wage was increased, then people who went to high school had a much higher employment rate before, and then the minimum wage was increased, and then the unemployment rate among high school educated rose dramatically. It is not racially equal that way, actually. Minimum wage increases have disproportionately hit black and brown people without college degrees, particularly. So
yeah, Ben Shapiro for the most part is correct. And it's also very interesting because the history of the minimum wage is outright racist. It was put forward with the expressed intent of pricing black and brown people out of employment. The first historical example I can think of is around 1904, if I recall correctly, with a labor union of trained firemen, whatever the hell that was, who lobbied their local government to have a minimum wage, specifically because they were being priced out by black laborers who were going to do exactly the same job they were, but were typically getting the jobs because they were willing to work for a lot less. And so once they got that minimum wage set up, they didn't have to worry about competition anymore.
That's also the reason why. It's better to and explains a lot more to frame this as certain market actors being privileged at the expense of others, and other people being forced to invest their resources into jobs that they hate, rather than how can we get people to work for less? Because obviously that sounds. That's first of all not really a realistic explanation of what would be happening if the government stopped existing, or if it just stopped intervening, but its infrastructure still existed. Well, then that would just mean that everybody would trade in the white market, and the state would be actually even more empowered than it usually is. But had this not been the case, and had the state sorry, I forgot. I lost my damn train of thought again. I apologize. What was I talking about?
What you were talking about is how how the minimum wage should be framed
Right.
as the
Right. Okay.
certain
Yes.
market
Yes.
actors being
Thank
privileged
you.
over others.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is that without intervention, more resources are produced. So it's not really that people. It's not really that as it's being framed currently, it insinuates that the competitive pay rates would, there would still be a competitive pay rate, but it would just go up. Best case scenario from the monetarist crowd. I've heard a lot of them try to rationalize how people being paid less would be better because because purchasing power would go up. That's technically correct, but it's like saying, well, you would have you would be paid in pennies, but everything would would cost fewer dollars. When it's more like you have a penny, but a penny can purchase a car. That's probably not how it would go down, but that's an example. I mean, because the point that they're trying to make, which they fundamentally can't because they're monetarists, is that people would have more bargaining leverage over their own pay, but they can't because they still argue positively for the cash nexus, so they have to talk within the context of a currency issued by fiat rather than actual currency. But
Another point I wanted to make in regards to the minimum wage and its racist history, prior to the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, which set the first federal minimum wage in the United States at 25 cents an hour, which I believe would probably be around $4 in today's dollars. Prior to that, blacks actually had a lower unemployment rate on average than whites. But as I'm sure you can imagine, once the Fair Labor Relations Act set up, you had that completely inverted. Gee, I wonder why.
Minimum wage has an explicitly racist, specifically eugenicist history behind it. Like it originates from the eugenics movement. And that was the reason. That was how it was initially framed for the first 2 to 3 decades of it existing. Was isn't it great that the government is stopping all these retards and basketball Americans from getting jobs? Just getting back to what I was saying earlier, libertarians need to really, really hammer home the point that there isn't a sort of disconnect between the ethical argument and the economic argument. And I've argued that point previously until fairly recently. However, I've thought about it a bit more. And I even expressed this in the recent debates we've hosted on the stream. But a necessary entailment of the government intervening is that it's depriving people of leverage over their own resources and access to resources that they could produce. So they should be seen as interchangeable. More specifically, government coercion, create poverty, and people being economically disempowered should be seen as an entailment of systemic coercion created by the state. They're one and the same. You could still be poor without the government if you just did nothing. But the government being there means that there will be sort of a permanent economic underclass, specifically because there are people who would like to would prosper better engaging in certain behaviors that the government is using force to stop them from doing.
Mm-hmm. Don't really have anything to add to that, so I'm just going to hit continue.
Why is raising the minimum wage overall a good idea?
Well, but you're right. Right now, maybe it's 2.3%. I take your word for the study, but that's at $7.25. And there are 30 million or so of Americans who make between $7.25 and $15. Now, I think the studies go both ways. Some people have argued, and there's studies showing that it increases productivity, it makes workers happier, it actually increases a business's profitability.
This is why I can't fucking stand cardinal units of measurement, which is what all prescriptive economic models are based around. It's essentially just making shit up, but a glorified form of that. If what counts as a positive economic outcome can be entirely arbitrarily dictated by the person creating the model, or what counts as an economy not actually being the result of observation, but just some person making shit up, drawing a parameter on a map and then saying, well, this is this economy, and that's what happened here, even though the people trading there don't even see it as a single economy. It's multiple economies interconnected within a single town. Yeah, you're gonna basically be able to come to any conclusion that you want. That's why it drives me crazy that people consider this to be a science. And this is a good example of how the politicization of reality that I've been talking about earlier in the stream, it's definitely not a recent phenomenon. Economics has been a politicized study practically since it became a serious study with the classical theorists.
There was something I wanted to say, but I'm going to back up a bit so I can recall what he said, because there was something he said that caught my attention.
And there are 30 million or so of Americans who make between $7.25 and $15. Now, I think the studies go both ways. Some people have argued, and there's studies showing that it increases productivity, it makes workers happier, it actually increases a business's profitability.
Well, yeah, this is what I was talking about earlier in the stream, in regards to them just like throwing studies back and forth, not being specific about which studies and where they came from. But it's really not important, because, well, SO talked about it already. You can put whatever. It entirely depends on what the researchers are looking for, what the researchers count as data or data points in regards to what they're looking for. And as I'm pretty sure you've all heard the phrase before, garbage in, garbage out. So it makes sense, like, even if you were to give two different researchers the same exact information, the same exact data with the same exact points, and got them to take a look at it and interpret it in their own ways, you're going to end up with wildly disparate and mutually exclusive different conclusions. But there's also like a good example of that I can think. A good example I can think of in regards to that is, he cited specifically that there's a study that says that businesses are more efficient after minimum wages increased. When I just can't help but think that there's two ways that could happen. Either one, or actually three ways that could happen. One, workers are more motivated to go to work and are generally more productive than they otherwise would be, just simply because morale is higher and they feel more enthusiastic about going to work. Two, they lose their job and they get replaced by robots, which are more efficient. Or three,
it kills a bunch of competitors.
That's not what that's one of them, but actually what I was thinking of is, so let's make this number 4. What it does is 4 people get fired, and now one person has to do 4 people's jobs. You still have one person, now they're doing a lot more than they otherwise would, but they're more productive now. So the question becomes, as we talked about before, what counts as production? How do you quantify production? And what you end up with is just like these statistics, these vague notions of, oh, it's just more productive, being thrown around as though that were a valid way of measuring whether or not a minimum wage is, quote, better or worse. Even the very way that this is framed is very dangerous, because it entirely depends on how one values what the minimum wages effects what the minimum wages effects are. You have, for example, the eugenicists who would see minimum wages effect on black unemployment and think, oh my goodness, this is absolutely freaking wonderful. But if you have I would say, more modern sensibility, and you probably see unemployment as a negative thing, you would see that exact same data point and think, oh my goodness, this is terrible. or you could be SRI, where you would be looking at black unemployment due to minimum wage, and we could come up with the interpretation of, oh my goodness, we have more counter economists now.
Right. That's sort of just what I was going to attempt to go over. Is if you really unpack what Anna said here, it's a completely meaningless statement. No standard of proof is provided, no explanation for why, obviously, that standard of proof is being used. Nothing specific's being cited. And I could go over the criteria that he provided. I'm not even going to touch happiness, but then there's, productivity. What counts as productivity? What are you calling productivity going up? What are you calling more, like, are you talking about a firm obtaining more resources to produce with? Because that does not mean the firm is better off. As we were talking about earlier, that creates all sorts of calculation problems. But I don't really have any more to say about that, and you kind of took the wind out of my sails by touching upon the same point I was trying to get to the whole time.
Great, means I'm learning. Anyways, let's go ahead and continue.
I agree. There's studies showing that that may not be the case. One interesting study I saw is that what it really forces businesses to do is require high school as a credential. And this a fair point would be saying that this may make it more difficult for those who haven't finished high school to get one of those jobs.
I love the mea culpa there. I know this is kind of like a minor point, but I loved it when I saw it in the video, and I'm glad that it's being brought up again here. So I kind of phrased that wrong. But anyways, what he said was, if it's a requirement for people to finish high school to get a job, then it may be kind of somewhat a little bit tricky for people who have not finished high school to get those jobs. That's not how that works. It's impossible. I mean, they can lie on their resume and stuff, but you've got to love just how much he's trying to avoid admitting. He's simultaneously admitting that there's an artificial scarcity in employment created by minimum wage without admitting that artificial scarcity in employment is created by the minimum wage. It's a very interesting song and dance that's being done here, and this guy is just being deliberately deceptive. I have no question about that in my mind.
Just sort of openly promoting the notion that, licensing standards are going to have to increase for these less influential firms in the white market, the more local firms. Kind of went over that earlier again, but I think that it's something that is just really starting to be scrutinized by the libertarian movement. But I think that it's I think that it's kind of a crucial point to hit, because it's not, that sort of forces proponents of political authority to also be very explicit about what they're suggesting by challenging the notion that licensing standards make firms accountable. No, that's actually the state trying to exercise leverage over how firms conduct their business by threatening them, by making it so they have certain privileges they otherwise wouldn't have if they don't have these licenses, if they haven't gone through those hoops.
Hey, play ball, or otherwise we'll make sure your magical piece of paper doesn't allow you to do frickin' business anymore. Because you need our magic piece of paper just to be able to make a frickin' living. Does that sound like freedom? Does that sound like a free society?
Make them defend that position.
Beautiful.
Libertarians would be a lot more successful in debate if that were the case. But anyway, should we continue?
Yes.
But for 90% of Americans who have a high school degree, they will be able to get that job and pay more. So I guess the studies there are studies all over the place on this. My view is that the country would be better off with a higher wage that would help productivity, help the happiness of our employees.
I mean,
He also touched upon something I think is referencing something you talked about earlier. You want to frame the minimum wage as a way to advantage some actors at the expense of others. And here he is glossing over, if assuming the 90% number is correct, that 10% of workers are just being completely screwed out of the labor market. I thought I thought he as a Democrat was trying to fight for the little guy. It's almost like politicians don't actually care at all.
Yeah, not even getting into the class analysis. He's just kind of nakedly saying here that this is gonna disadvantage people. It's just that the political, because of that sort of political framework that we were talking about earlier, one of the nastiest things that it does to people is if it's their political affiliation doing it, then they never see themselves as the target, even though they are very much the target of that. They don't see themselves as that 10% who could potentially be disadvantaged. They see themselves as that 90% who's making $1 or $2 more.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you can't really blame people. They oftentimes have their own cognitive bias that they associate their own personal identity with this particular framework of understanding reality through the lens of the religion of statism, and as such, anything that threatens that personal identity is going to be viewed as an existential threat to themselves personally. And what could be better of a threat against that than the notion that, hey, maybe I'm part of that 10% that'll be screwed over? Nah, that can't be true.
In reality, it's literally everybody being screwed over, and the only people who are benefiting are the Bezoses of the world and the politicians. But
I don't see a difference. I see Bezos and the like are as part of the political ruling class. So I don't really see a differentiation. The difference is that Bezos isn't officially a politician.
Right.
So anyways, let's go ahead and continue.
The simple kind of rebuttal of that is if it really improved profitability for businesses to provide higher wages, then they would do it. Meaning you wouldn't need the government to actually step in and force them to do it, being that businesses are profit-driven primarily.
It's a fair point. That's if you believe that businesses
profit. What counts as profit? Oh, that's actually kind of an important question they need to answer, because profit is subjective.
Mm-hmm. For all you know, it's just like you could have people who just find it enjoyable to lose money.
That's not more what I was thinking, but I mean, sure. What I had in mind was the fact that you can make more money but be less satisfied because what you really want is free time, or what you really want is to socialize more. That's why that's the reason why wage cuck positions are a thing, or why there's definitely a sort of bluesy feeling associated with it.
Mm-hmm. Now it was a bit of a ludicrous example, I admit, but it is I think a valid one. And yeah, you're right. Like, what constitutes profit? Although I think in this context, what Shapiro is trying to mean, especially since he's a monetarist, is profit in the sense of revenue for a firm minus expense being a positive number. And so with this in mind, the point he's trying to make is that if simply increasing your employees' wages is going to be more profitable for a business, then they could theoretically just keep scaling that up. And if that's true, then you could theoretically just scale it up infinitely to the point where you would have firms that would pay their workers $100 bazillion a second, and they would just be like they would just be paving their facilities with solid gold for just how profitable they are.
I mean, you
Financially
could.
profitable.
I mean, yeah, that's an approach that you could take. Why not just pay people $1 million an hour?
Yep. I did a video about that, and that I actually watched that video not too long ago again, and it still holds up pretty well.
Yeah,
That the
except the MMT theorists will just say print more money, whereas Keynesians would have kind of folded on that one, because Keynesians would have at least acknowledged the basic reality that money represents a very real thing. Investment, scarcity. It's supposed to be. I should say fiat, not money. But money is supposed to be something that's that has utility, that's seen as being valued by everyone within an economy.
Mm-hmm. But one of the
So,
points I made in my $1 million an hour minimum wage video, especially towards the end, is that if all of the points in regards to why the minimum wage should be raised as high as they say are valid at $15 an hour, at $32 an hour, at $1 million an hour, then there is no upper limit in regards to how high the minimum wage ought to be. And yeah, the Keynesians are going to concede that, but for the modern monetary theorists who would hear what I say and just would agree with me, then they would also have to concede that any kind of limit whatsoever on a wage and how high it could possibly be represents nothing less than Scrooge McDuck's style miserly cruelty.
the government just decides how valuable money is. They could just print more money so more firms could pay people $1 million an hour. Duh.
The only way that a modern monetary theorist could possibly promote a minimum wage and not just be a horrible piece of shit who was unironically trying to prevent people from being able to enjoy the quintillionaire lifestyle is to put forward an infinity in our minimum wage.
MMT is the equivalent of relativism to economic theory, because one of the fundamental premises of MMT is that money is created by the government. So yeah, I don't take it seriously as a theory. Sorry, sorry, retards, if you're watching.
I mean, to be fair, I don't think they've watched this far into the stream, just simply because like they realize that we're actually using words, and that's probably a lot more than their brains can handle at the moment. So, anyways, let's go ahead and continue.
Acting in their rational long-term interest. My view is that sometimes businesses are very short-term focused.
I noticed that also Kahana is always framing his arguments as, well, it's my view that, 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 well, it's your view that, well, it's my view that.
Yeah, it's a very political rhetorical trick. You're not making statements about the nature of reality. The nature of statements of principle are just the same as statements of preference.
Mm-hmm. Everything is just entirely framed around. Everything is framed as though it were some kind of relativist statement of preferences. You're basically just throwing your own ideas and preferences at each other and just hoping that the other person would just be kowtowed into accepting your preferences just by the sheer brilliance of how wonderful your opinions are. It doesn't. It's clearly very. I mean, we know that this guy is just being hilariously deceptive, which is probably why, at least I personally am picking on him a lot more than Shapiro. Shapiro, I can at least believe that he's trying to make a genuine argument that he actually kind of understands. It's not great. I mean, for one thing, as pointed out earlier, he's a monetarist. He still frames things from the basis of the cash nexus, and still treats things like the labor market as though it were a single hegemonic entity and not individuals and groups of individuals all seeking their most highly valued preferences. But
The problem,
he's at least honest somewhat. Kahana, I'm sorry, let me refer to him correctly. Kahana is deceptive. He is obfuscating and using political pseudo-speak to try to hoodwink us, the audience, into all sorts of absolutely insane ideas, while at the same time positioning himself just saying like, oh, don't take anything I take too seriously. I'm just expressing my views. I'm not expressing any concrete facts or claims about reality. Of course not. Don't be ridiculous.
I should have elaborated when I mentioned earlier that if you're arguing from within the cash nexus, then you can't ever properly represent sound money. The reason for that is that in order to properly put forward an argument for sound money, interest rates have to be determined by market actors. Because money is itself something that in that situation would emerge because it's simply preferred by whoever's acting in that economy, and they want to use it as a way to obtain their specialized interests, but nobody has a specialized interest for what's being used as money. Everybody sees it as universally being preferable. So but yeah, the problem, though, arguing this position from within the cash nexus is that interest rates are planned by a central bank. So it's not possible to argue that position.
Mm-hmm.
They conflict with each other inherently.
Mm-hmm. So anyways, let's go ahead and continue.
And may not be making the long-term investments. But the second case is, I mean, let me ask you, I mean, are there any times you believe that the government should interfere? For example, overtime laws, we're required to pay time and a half. Would you support that? I mean, there are a lot of times that the state has made regulations to say that this helps the bargaining power and makes for a better labor market.
Yeah.
Motherfucker. The state, by default, has a greater claim over everyone and every resource within its infrastructure. Using state violence to obtain greater bargaining power is like fucking jumping off a cliff to not die.
It's
literally no organization in modernity has more fucking bargaining leverage than the state and political actors.
There really isn't. It really doesn't make any sense. I'm just trying to, let me just back up a bit here.
Overtime laws, we're required to pay time and a half. Would you support that? I mean, there are a lot of times that the state has made regulations to say that this helps the bargaining power and makes for a better labor market.
Yeah,
And keep in mind
power.
keep in mind though that what he's arguing is that this isn't what actually happened. What he's arguing is that this was the quote unquote intention behind the law. That's meaningless because, as we've established, the only thing that political decrees do is use violence to make resources less available. So I don't give a fuck what your intention is, especially if you're marketing it as being the conclusion of a political decree being sort of followed by the state. Now, another thing that I was going to touch upon earlier, aside from the fact that this ought to be, very interesting and is going to, further reveal, Ben Shapiro as a bit of a snake in the grass, is I'm sorry, could you play that clip again, because I lost my train of thought.
Well, before I do, I remember what I was going to talk about before, and then I forgot again. So,
Short-term
Um,
focus and may not be making the long-term investments. But the second case is, I mean, let me ask you, I mean, are there any times you believe that the government should interfere? For example, overtime.
Okay, so we didn't even touch upon that point, but he's arguing that there's just sort of an overarching thing that market actors need to work towards to profit, quote unquote, independently, of course, of their own interests as people. It's just in order for the market to prosper, in order that they need to be operating at this level. So he is trying to rationalize administrative pricing. He's not actually talking about market incentives. He's talking about the incentives that the state has, what the state demands of market actors. Very important thing to establish there, but unless you had anything to say, can we continue?
I did have something to say, but I can't quite remember what it is. I lost my train of thought twice, so hopefully I'll remember.
Okay, I'm glad that it's not just happening to me.
Laws. We're required to pay time and a half. Would you support that? I mean, there are a lot of times that the state has made regulations to say that.
Okay, I remember what I was going to say.
Yeah,
now.
no, I'm very much against.
Without the cash nexus, most people could just network with other people for more specialized tasks. But for most tasks, most people could just sort of produce out of the home and barely have to do any work and have an equal amount of leverage over themselves and their resources as everybody else would have, because there's no organization like the state exerting a monopoly on violence over society.
Don't really have anything. I can't remember what I was going to say.
All right. Well, we could just continue then.
Yeah, this is the part where Ben Shapiro stops being anyone worth listening to.
Very much against virtually all of that. I'm extremely libertarian when it comes to labor markets, particularly because I believe that monopoly is actually created by some of the regulatory innovations that people have come up with. In fact, I think there's a reason why big corporations have typically pushed for a higher minimum wage when it becomes clear this is going to happen, because you're right, Amazon can absorb that blow a lot more easily than the mom and pop shop that is down the street. It actually increases their ability to drive other people out of the market. If everybody is required to pay a higher wage, then Amazon can spread that out over the price of its products. It can spread it out over its 83% market share in like the book market. It can upcharge.
No, where it spreads through is the various subsidies that it receives from the government that gives it a significant competitive advantage over any kind of alternatives. Most notably, the huge amount it gets in reduced rates for transportation and shipping through the United States Postal Service. A lot of people don't know about that, but large part of Amazon's business model relies on this special deal it has with the USPS, which gives it a significant competitive advantage compared to literally anyone else.
Yeah, a lot of people don't think about the post office in the context of it being the government's way of monopolizing commerce. How supplies are shipped to certain economies, and who has the ability to do this? Like, who can have these supply deals with these postal services? It's not just exclusive to. It's not just exclusive to the post office, though the post office does have a significant amount of leverage over, quote unquote, private competitors like UPS. Although, considering that they are white market actors as well, they're being used effectively for the same purpose. They have, they're being empowered or used, no matter how you want to see it, by the state in order to control commerce and how products are delivered from market to market.
Hmm. Oh, but Esso, don't you know the United States Postal Service is in the United States Constitution, so therefore it's good.
Yeah. Well, just getting back to the point that you were making, even though the commerce monopoly, if you want to call it that, that's a big way in which the government externalizes maintenance costs. It's not even in the top 10 of the specific privileges or subsidies that the government creates that that make it so firms like Amazon can scale up to where they are.
All right, let's continue.
People on the product in a way that small mom and pop stores cannot. Increase in minimum wage obviously disproportionately affects places that have 3 employees as opposed to places that have 300 employees, of which 30 are actually minimum wage employees.
But you're right about that, and this is you're right that the impact on certain small businesses is harder, and that we have to take action to help those small businesses. I mean, I acknowledge
Almost as though there isn't just a single labor market.
Money. Also, you gotta love how he's just throwing this out. We gotta take action to protect them. Money printer go brrr. And what that really means is economic leverage exercised by the state over private entities and individuals operating using their own resources go brrr.
Need to protect them means it's in the state's interest right now to exercise more planning over more direct planning over a greater aspect of the market. And as of recently, it seems specifically though that attitude is being directed towards finances. Financial markets, specifically investment banks.
Mm-hmm.
We can should we continue?
Yeah, let's go ahead and continue.
That point. I will say though that in small communities, rural communities, often you have the case that these are highly concentrated markets, and in that case, you have employers having a lot more monopsony power to be able to set the wage in not truly competitive markets. But to the extent that my comments in the past were not sensitive enough in the way I phrased it to the challenges of small business, I acknowledge that challenge. I agree with you
Okay.
that it's going to be.
So I just wanted to bring this up that both of them are missing. And are you familiar with an economic principle called Bersodi's law?
I am not.
So essentially, it's just as the economic operation of a firm extends into more economies, but management becomes more centralized. It is less profitable for a firm to operate this way. Imagine if you started off with a tech company with just one HQ, but that tech company wanted to spread its business to 5 other national economies, because we're talking about the modern day here. You would need 6 different HQs, and they would all need to have their own infrastructures.
Mm-hmm.
So what he's talking about here is just nonsense. What's hilarious, though, is I don't see many people talking about Bersodi's law, even though it's very important in the context of economies of scale. But the few articles or essays I have seen on the subject are just absurd. They're laughable.
How so?
One that I found claims that the current state of the oil market refutes Bersodi's law,
Huh?
pointing to examples of firms or industries where the state has has systematically privileged these actors and basically run the entire fucking market, are apparently examples of Bersodi's law being invalidated.
Huh? I'm just trying to scratch. I'm trying to process that logic and try to figure out like where the hell they could possibly be coming from to get to
Centralized
that to try to get to that conclusion. And I'm just coming up empty because
Centralized business operations are inherently less profitable as the firm scales upwards. Nuh-uh. The state came along and externalized the maintenance cost of these firms that scaled upwards. Therefore, that's not a real economic principle. Smack.
yeah, that's that is probably the dumbest thing I've heard all day. I'm just gonna go ahead and say that.
It's like the first article if you read into it on Google.
I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised if it's positioned on the algorithm. That sounds like something that Google would do. Position it deliberately
Alright.
on the algorithm specifically so that a criticism, a terrible criticism, mind you, but a criticism nonetheless, is the first thing you
Yeah,
find.
that's dumb even as far as statists are concerned.
Yeah. Anyways, let's continue.
Much harder for
Sure.
certain small businesses, and we have to be honest about it. I mean, we can't. I want to engage in an honest conversation, and to pretend that there's small businesses that aren't going to be effective and that should be helped would not be correct.
We'll get to more with Congressman
Except you've
Rokon.
Is
Except-
this over, or is this like a break?
Oh my god, is it seriously over?
I don't know. I'm just gonna keep playing.
17th District of California in just 1 second. He's a Democrat from Silicon Valley. And let me tell you something.
Oh, okay, it's
They
an
build a
ad.
secure tunnel between your devices and the internet. Only VPN I trust because they computer. See, here's ExpressVPN. 3 months of Express without setting one standard minimum wage across an entire country
Okay,
where
can
wages are
you-
extremely different.
Yeah, we gotta go back a second. Because I think we missed some stuff. But I was gonna say something, but I forgot what I was going to say. That is a hell of a freeze frame.
Let me see this.
I don't know what's showing up on your screen, but this is the freeze frame on mine.
I got the same one.
So
I'm just
that's-
like I'm silent
okay.
because I'm just like I'm trying to figure out like what is that face? What is
Okay.
that?
That's someone blinking mid-sentence. But yeah, I just wanted to make sure that everyone on stream was seeing what I'm seeing. Okay, it's not the fault of Ben Shapiro. It's just you can't really control freeze frames, but
It's what I refer to as TiVo face. Anyways, I'm just gonna,
because people, when they're not really thinking about the face they're making, such as in mid conversation when you are pausing screen, you can mine some great Photoshop material out of those.
it's an untapped well of memes that is
They're
just
in
continuously it's an inexhaustible supply of memes.
And it's in practically every form of media. Just look at cartoons like Phineas turning his head and the frame or two where he's looking directly at the camera.
That is, I've seen that. It's cursed, and I want it to not exist. I mean, I know why it exists because I've dabbled in animation before, and between frames are always going to look strange. I mean, they kind of have to, but yeah,
Imagine being the person who drew that.
those guys basically get paid to just mass produce freeze frame or in between frames. The way animation is done is that you have a whole bunch of keyframes that are made like
Yeah,
one-
I'm aware.
yeah, it's
but
once
I
every
guess
second.
You could explain for the audience.
Yeah, so every second or half second, you have professional animators, like the guy that make the big money, to draw a particular pose. and the animation is basically just an animatic that's a frame every 15 seconds. And then what you do is you hire someone, and you have like big firms in places like South Korea and Japan, of people who just get paid very tiny amounts of money to fill in the animation, to fill in like additional poses and in between frames from one keyframe to the next keyframe. And when your entire job is to, like, for 10 hours a day, just draw each pose individually from one frame to the next frame to the next frame, naturally you're really gonna start to not really pay attention to what you're drawing. Just as long as
God, I
it looks good to move from one keyframe to the next keyframe.
bet the South Korean sweatshop workers who make The Simpsons are happy about The Simpsons' liberal politics.
Oh yeah,
Got them
I'm sure.
got their advocacy for statism that got them into the position they're in the first place in their their national economy.
Their white market. It's
Yeah.
it's a thing of monstrous beauty. Anyways, I'm gonna go ahead and continue here.
Is my data. That is the important thing. Protect your data today. Find out how you can get 3 months of ExpressVPN for free by visiting expressvpn.com/Ben or clicking the link in the description box below. And the other big problem with a federal minimum wage is that it is federal. I mean, when we were talking about setting one standard minimum wage across an entire country, where wages are extremely different in Mississippi than they are in California. In California, a $15 minimum wage in a place like your district or a place where I was living until very recently, LA, you get a $15 minimum wage. That buys you like a 1-bedroom studio apartment. If you get a $15 minimum wage in Mississippi, that is literally the median wage in Mississippi, right? There are states where there are wildly disparate numbers as far as what wages are actually worth in particular states. Why in the world would the federal government set a federal minimum wage that is so high that it is actually at or close to, I believe the median wage in Mississippi right now is $14.23 an hour.
Why does that only work? Why does that only work for the wage market, though? And why, that's not even getting into the other problems here. The assumption that there is a single labor market.
It does undermine the idea of a single national labor market, especially when he pointed out that, different wages for the same dollar value are going to have different effects and different meanings in different parts of the country.
Yeah,
And
okay.
he's very clearly pointing out, he's very clearly identifying, without actually identifying, that there is no such thing as a single national economy. There are various regional, local, and household economies that are all going to be affected differently by the same amount of, or the same dollar amount of wage.
Why, from Ben Shapiro's perspective, does this not seem strange then that every white market economy conducts itself around the exact same models of firm? Why does it not seem strange then that we see sort of a uniformity of the ways in which people meet their ends in certain aspects of the white market, such as investment banking? Why is the same money used by every economy?
Because capitalism. Capitalism good.
I mean, I was gonna say, when you just left it at because capitalism, depending on the way you're using that term, sure.
Yeah. So, anyways, I think we should continue.
In that sense, where we're talking about the cash nexus and artificial property claims, that's in direct contrast with a free market. So, just to clarify.
All right. Anyways, where's the?
They set a median wage, a minimum wage that is above the median wage in a place like Mississippi, when a minimum wage in California, $15 an hour, basically buys you a candy bar.
Well, again, this is the debate about the floor. I agree with you. In my district, $15 isn't enough. And the question is, should there be regional variance? Yes. And then the question becomes, what is the floor?
I mean, we have a federalist system, so there's a real easy solution here, right? I mean, we actually have like cities and states, and they could do this sort of thing.
Right.
Okay, so I guess it's wrong for the federal government to have to set a minimum wage. But when you
It's
have
okay for states to. It's okay for individual states or city governments to try to prescribe economies.
Of course, I mean, I don't know about you, but whenever the federal government wants to use coercion and violence to force me to use my resources in certain ways and use violence when I'm doing things that they don't happen to like, it makes me feel sad. But when my state governor uses state violence to prevent me from using my resources in ways that he doesn't like, I feel better about it. Because that's totally how that works, right?
Yeah, listening to Ben Shapiro explain this has got me feeling like this freeze frame.
Unfortunately, let me see if I can't get that on screen, actually. Give me a second here. This freeze frame. It's a little bit off center. Anyways, like let me just go ahead and set that thing back to the way it was.
But the question is,
Okay.
Whoop.
Shall we continue?
Yeah.
We don't have a whole lot go over. I don't really know what's coming up because I haven't seen the video, but we seem to be going back to previous points a lot. So
Yeah, we might
I think it's getting to where we might want to think about wrapping it up pretty soon.
Yeah, I think the same thing. Let's see where this goes, though.
right, but the question is, there should be a national floor, and now I'm saying the floor should be $15. Do you believe there should be any floor? I mean, do you think? I mean, $7.25 I think is unreasonable. I mean, for example, Cotton and Romney have said the floor should be $10. I think Holly is saying it should be $15, but for billion corporations, where would you set the floor?
I mean, there is a. I mean, unfortunately, there is a floor, and the floor is zero, and it's going to be felt by 1.4 million people who won't have a job come 2025 if we raise this to $15 minimum wage.
I guess my question is
also
for you, would you
not
support?
Not related to what they just said, but fuck Josh Hawley. That's all I wanted to say, unless you were curious and wanted to ask. But
I was actually curious as to what was going on because I feel like I'm forgetting something.
No, they didn't say anything that we haven't already gone over, and or you know, but I can't read your mind. So if you wanted to say something in response, I wouldn't know.
I got nothing. Let's continue.
Any national federal minimum wage at any standard?
No. I mean, I think free labor is able to bargain, and if you can come up with a case where you have an actual monopoly that is violating labor law in its attempts to cram down a wage on a person who's unwilling to accept it. First of all, we have an amendment to the Constitution that prevents involuntary servitude, and second of all, bargaining.
The 13th Amendment does not stop involuntary servitude. In fact, it's multiple times there are instances of involuntary servitude that are going on to this day. It's called the U.S. prison system.
I was just about to say, tell that to the prisons that are using slave labor to manufacture those thin blue line flags that you conservatards love so much.
And of course, we shouldn't even go into, what's that called? A little thing called conscription. You know, where people are enslaved to be cannon fodder for the state. Kind of important.
It's kind of insane, though, and this is what I was talking about earlier in the Discord with some people in the Backalley Discord when we were talking about Constitution. Well, I've critiqued the idea of there being a uniform. It's not my critique; it's actually John Hasnass's critique. But I've expressed I agree with it, and I've expressed why I think that it's valid previously. His critique, by the way, is that there can't ever be a uniform interpretation of a constitutional statement or something that's written into law, because there isn't like a Platonic context that concepts exist within. For example, what counts as speech what counts as the government protecting speech, etc. Those are all extremely controversial things. But this is also operating around the assumption that whatever fucking reason that a lot of people seem to like argue this position, but they operate around the assumption that law somehow constricts what the state can do, or somehow like is something that stops the state. Who's enforcing the law? The state. So no, and because of the various institutions that the state has propped up, it has a greater claim by default over your resources and yourself. So, not ethically speaking, of course, just in terms of the modern society we live in, one where a state is present.
In terms of its ability to exercise leverage over people's resources.
It's a matter of leverage, and laws are simply an attempt by the state to coordinate whatever these laws are being interpreted as at any given time. It's not something that stops what the state can do. That's politicians coordinating the police and the military to threaten people in certain ways. In ways which are beneficial to the state and its institutions.
All the constitutions do is just use more of that propaganda that I keep referencing back, in the sense that you get people to legitimize, or you legitimize the government to people on the basis that it's not only useful for their interests, but its capacity to abuse its power is fundamentally limited because we have this magical little piece of paper called the Constitution. Somehow this prevents it from enslaving you, from exercising coercion over you should you speak in ways that they don't like, from preventing you from being aggressed against by the state in other ways. And somehow this is able to trick gullible people, or at least satisfy people enough such that they don't take action to subvert the state's influence in their lives.
That pic that I just sent in.
Oh yeah, I've seen that.
Love it.
Yeah, sorry, there's no clear image to stream pipeline, so unfortunately you guys aren't able to see it. But anyways, let's go ahead and continue.
Power is still a thing. I mean, the fact is that there are wages that people cannot charge because people will not take the jobs for those wages. I mean, that does exist. And by the way, if you're worried about wages being depressed, then there's a case to be made that one of the things we should be worried about is cracking down on businesses that are using illegal immigration in states like California, for example.
I love how legal immigration is now counter-economic praxis.
Yeah. Here's the thing. It's already illegal in the white market to hire a counter economist in the labor market, i.e., someone who immigrated just without the state's knowledge, or not through the approved channels, I should say. So by approved channels, I mean the legal means. They didn't bend over to the state. And, that's, I don't blame a lot of them, because, these 150-year waiting periods are kind of, not ideal. But here's what conservatards are really talking about when they're talking about cracking down on illegal immigration, because these people that they're referring to aren't even trading in the same markets as the types of firm that are being discussed in the stream here, which is white market firms, because they can't be hired by white market firms. The state will come after them. The state will make it hurt, so to speak. only thing the thing that illegal immigrants can do though is they can bolster local counter economies, and that's typically what they do. So really, this position is it's a direct spit in the face to free markets and specifically to the counter economists. I mean, it's not like it actually hurts us because we're just gonna do it anyway, and I don't really care about your whining as a statist. But yeah, it's kind of it's crazy to see this defended as a position in defense of a free market, because it's literally a type of protectionism. It's a type of intervention. It's a type of planning in the labor market. But it's even crazier to see like paleos try to defend this shit, like Hoplu or those guys.
Why is it surprising?
It's not surprising. If I used the term surprising, that's not what I meant. It's just concerning to see because monetarists have been accepted as being roughly equivalent to Austro-libertarians, stuff like that's become acceptable. And literally, to make it less risky to illegally immigrate is to disempower the state, because it means that the state has less influence over the labor that is being coordinated in various local economies.
It demonstrates, or it reduces the amount of leverage that the state has in terms of its ability to decide who people can and cannot associate with, in addition to who they can and cannot engage in commerce with, who they can and cannot sign contracts with. So all this crap does in terms of immigration restrictions and ridiculous ideas like that, it's just serving the state's interest. Which, I mean, it's not terribly surprising that paleos are going to be operating in that way because, well, they kind of have a long and glorious history of unintentionally or not empowering the state and advocating for policies and ideas that empower the state. And I did say policies deliberately that empower the state, and then have the audacity to call it libertarianism.
Yeah, pragmatism though.
Pragmatism, right, yeah, sure.
Because it doesn't matter what you're calling libertarianism. Libertarianism is just a conclusion that exists in a vacuum. Nothing it needs to be entailed to arrive at libertarian conclusions.
Just say whatever you just say that whatever you're doing is pragmatic, and you can justify literally anything.
Everything can be used as a justification for achieving libertarian ends, even even extending to actual wars, which I've seen.
Pol Pot exterminated millions of people in the Cambodian killing fields as a pragmatic measure to achieve libertarianism in Cambodia.
Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge was the best covenant community. What are you talking about?
No. North Korea is the best covenant community. I thought we were clear on that.
Nazi Germany was the best covenant community.
Adolf Hitler was the greatest Hoppian.
Oh my god.
I mean, Nazism is a pragmatic measure that needs to be taken and is necessary in order to achieve libertarianism.
I love it. Nazism is a pragmatic step towards libertarianism. We should make that basically the new version of Kim Jong-un is the best minarchist. Guys from the back alley watching this stream, that would be a great meme. I'd love to see that.
Do it.
Nazism is a pragmatic step. The funny part is that's actually not too far away from what actual Hoppians, not all, but some of them have argued. you remember that one, that Hoppy and Snake meme cartoon where the snack is like pulling on a lever, or well, I should say pushing the lever based on where they're positioned. And at the other end of it is anarcho capitalism, the ANCAP flag, but there are like different stages on the lever, and between where we're at, modernity and anarcho capitalism. One of the steps there is literally is literally a fasci.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember that one.
I'm
gonna see if I can't find it and show it on screen because
I was just about to do the same thing, or I was gonna try the same thing because I would love for people watching to see that.
well, the good news is I actually have that saved in my files, and now people can see it on stream. Yeah, you have the lever is currently in between social democracy and the American flag. Then you have fascism, monarchism, just the number 1776, the Confederate flag, and then anarcho-capitalism. You gotta love, like, first off, you gotta love this they're unintentionally admitting to believing in a dialectical materialism. And then in order
not even to mention that, you know, literally using the allegory of a lever can't make it any more clear that they're operating around a structuralist interpretation of what a society is.
It's just a lever, you see, and we gotta grab it. We gotta move it. We just gotta make sure that we scientifically understand how to engineer society towards certain objectives that we know and with absolute certainty are true. And so we just gotta do it. I mean, that's not at all a technocratic understanding of society whatsoever.
But yeah, should we continue on the actual subject of the stream, or
yeah, let's go ahead.
Are we just gonna end it? All right, we'll go
But what
for
were you saying
another response or two.
All right.
To the argument for monopsony, which even Friedman argues. Now, in fairness, he says this is a rare case.
Even Friedman
against minimum wage. I mean,
which one?
Oh man, he's talking about Milton Friedman.
I know. I'm just being facetious.
Man, Milton Friedman was saying it. Therefore, it's obviously true.
Right. Yeah, I forgot. Milton Friedman was never wrong about anything ever. He is the gold standard by which anything and everything could ever possibly be correct in history. And if Milton Friedman says monopsony is a valid concept, then that clearly means that we need a $15 an hour minimum wage. How do the two connect? I don't know. But Milton Friedman, therefore $15 an hour minimum wage.
Not even talking about the sort of premises that monetarism operate around, or the principles they claim to espouse. No, it's just Milton Friedmanism. Seems to be this guy's the way he's attempting to frame that entire area of study. If Milton Friedman said it, then monetarists obviously argue in favor of it.
He's probably under the impression that
on any subject
they probably fall into the assumption that conservatards follow Milton Friedman in a kind of cult of personality, which, in all honesty, is probably not too far from the truth.
Kind of like how all Austrians are obviously sock dems because Hayek was a sock dem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. So, anyways, let's continue.
Just in fairness, but he says, look, there are cases where you have one or two employers in a town and they're not charging a competitive price because you don't have the choice to go to 4 or 5 different employers. And in those cases, it's a market failure. That certainly seems as one case. And then we can disagree about negotiating. But I guess the broader point for
We can disagree about how people will negotiate. How about you just fucking let people negotiate around whatever their interests are?
I don't even know if like having 4 or 5 employers in an area. I'm assuming that it's like a very small area with maybe like population of 20 people, and
Stop.
there's only like so many resources and people is organized in 4 or 5 different firms. How that would constitute a market failure? What even is a market failure? Can you define that? Like if people are exchanging their resources and associating voluntarily in such a way that is able to meet everyone's individual, most highly valued individual preferences, and that can only occur when people are able to do so freely. Otherwise, these associations and exchanges will never occur.
Yeah.
And how could
well,
that ever be considered a market failure, except by expressing some kind of subjective preference against whatever the result of those exchanges happens to be?
market failure only makes sense within the context of economic planning, because it assumes that there is just sort of a force that is the market, that all of society is just structured around trying to meet the needs of. This isn't actually a study of economics. This is actually a critique of prescriptive modeling that I don't see that often, but it should be made more. That it's not study of how people associate as it frames itself, because implicit in any prescriptive economic model is the assumption that all of these actors are working towards the interests of some other group. It's 100% just apologism or economic planning, or an attempt to create to rationalize a pretext for economic planning.
That definitely seems to be the case. Everything is highly around how it is that the economy is able to not achieve some objective. It's not necessarily achieving the interests of one group. I mean, it actually kind of is, namely himself. And anytime it doesn't meet his own preferences, it seems to be a quote unquote market failure. Now, of course,
If every person associates in pursuit of their most highly valued preference, how can you say there's a market failure here?
the only way, as I said
Unless,
before, the only way you can
unless the market is being used in the same way as country is in the context of political statements. Ergo, it's a thinly veiled euphemism for political interests, for the state's interests.
is the market meeting the state's goals and objectives? Yes, great. Is it meeting its goals and objectives now? No, market failure. That's pretty much how it works. Even if
Not even the market's interests. There's no such group or person or organization as the market.
no, there
It's
isn't.
it's entirely just the economic planners that are being referred to. Oh, these guys, we can't meet the rates like this that would need this parasitic class to continue prospering. Well, fuck them.
We never needed them in the first place, and they can just go away. Personally, I can't wait to just see them just go to have. One thing I absolutely appreciate, and this is kind of going off topic, but the 1/6 incident, that horrific atrocity of the Capitol siege, where armed insurrectionists entered the Capitol building and moved through the velvet rope.
How can I forget? literally this generation's 9/11.
I mean, I'm pretty sure you've seen like just how freaked out the politicians were by that. Now, I don't know how much of their like terror that they show on TV is genuine and how much of it is just theater. But if that's what freaked them out, I mean, I'd love to see what their reaction for what could possibly be happening in the future is going to be.
All right.
Anyways, let's go ahead and hit the
One
thing.
more
In my view, Ben,
response.
is because I believe in entrepreneurship, I believe in innovation, I believe in capitalism. I call myself a progressive capitalist. Is when we're producing such incredible wealth, trillions of dollars in my district, the ability to have people earn a wage that allows them to live a decent life seems to be something that's good for our democracy.
Yeah.
So, given that we live in a society that is able to produce all of this wealth, I find it ridiculous that we as a society are not able to give our workers $1 trillion an hour in a minimum wage. I mean, that would just be good for our democracy. You gotta love
Yeah,
this.
watching any sort of economic planner try to flirt around with the idea of purchasing power in relation to in relation to either bargaining leverage or money is absolutely hilarious.
I mean, they're trying. They're just not very good at it. So
But
anyway, I think I mean, the video is not quite over, but I think we're kind of just touching on topics we already, discussed.
if there is another point, it's probably not too far from, it didn't fall too far from the tree of what we've been responding to already.
Mhm.
So I think that unless anyone in the chat has anything that they would like to say, we could probably just end the stream here.
All right, let's take a look and see what we got here. Spaniard says conservators don't understand that cheaper labor options will keep more businesses around longer since they are able to save some money. Who cares what the immigrants do with the money? They print it constantly.
Well, yeah, but I think more fundamentally, though, what it does, though, is it's because of the fact that the state explicitly has created this standard where some people will be threatened with violence if they didn't enter the area that's being called the nation the way that the state claims that they should. I think more fundamentally, the problem that the state runs into is that the state has less influence over the resources that are being produced or who's consuming them because they have to be. The state has made it, as an unwitting byproduct of their own planning in the labor market. So these people are essentially forced into being counter economists. In order for them to merely live in that nation, they have to be counter economists.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, I
yeah,
don't really have anything to add to that.
appreciate the comment. But I think that the way that we should be looking at it more is uh, the specific class of markets we're looking at. The difference between the white market and the gray and black markets. Because there's a notable analytic reason for distinguishing between them. It's because the gray and black markets operate entirely outside of the cash nexus. However, because gray markets still intersect with the white market in that they're competing directly with white market firms, the incentives of gray market firms can be influenced by legalization or deregulation. It can those things can further empower white market actors at the direct expense of gray market actors, which is why ultimately what empowers the black market's the most subversive.
It goes without saying that there's a reasonable case to be made that that's probably the objective.
Right. Well, the objective is to subvert the state's political institutions in the first place so that there isn't risk associated with trying to trade around the state, because it's impossible for the state to enforce its monopolies and externalize the maintenance costs of certain market actors in society, because it's already more profitable to associate outside of the white market. Otherwise, the state wouldn't need to use violence to disincentivize people from doing so.
Mm-hmm. So, anyways, don't really have much more to add to that. Do you?
Oh, I'm good.
All right, so I think we can go ahead and wrap up the stream here.
All right.
So we'll be doing this again on Tuesday. I'm not sure we're gonna be doing Friday streams anymore, but we'll see. But anyways, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, we might, but the problem with Friday streams is that it's the sort of topics that we can talk about are limited because of the hour time frame. Yeah, we'll see how that turns out.
Yeah. But anyways, yeah, everyone, thank you for stopping by, and